Welcome to New Zealand World News channel of positive feedback and positive messages that we always thrive for. And today we are introducing and we are having a conversation with an elected board member, Rob Gore, who also is a youth wing, strong youth wing advocator and presenter of NZ First Party. But we are today having a conversation with him with regard to how we are future-proofing our nation, and we have to see from the young generation's point of view of what he has to offer in terms of that. So I will be having a good conversation on various topics with him, and let's see what our young generations are really looking forward to, how they can build the nation, and we as a nation, how we can rebuild this. So this is all about working together, rebuilding the nation. So let's introduce you now to Rob Gore. Welcome, Rob. Thank you very much for having us to come and actually have a conversation with us on some of the key topics that after COVID-19 we all are facing. And it will be awesome to see your visions really are, rather than any political scoring. This is all about how individually we can come together. So over to you, Rob. Tell us something about you, what your so far journey has been, and what you are really looking forward for your future journey.
Okay. Morena, thank you very much for having me on this beautiful morning in Auckland. So my name's Rob Gore. West Auckland born and bred. So the whare, the household that I'm currently in, is the same household that my father was raised in and that my grandfather built way back in the 1950s when our family first moved from Aotearoa, Napier in the Hawke's Bay up to Auckland. I've been involved in New Zealand First for about 5 years now. I started off when I was in university studying political science and history, and a friend of mine sort of dragged me kicking and screaming into this nascent political youth wing while there were members and activists before, it never had a formal or constitutionally recognised organisation. So we were part of that process by which young people in New Zealand First had a formal recognised voice and a seat at the table. In that time, we were heavily involved in the last election, whether it was the campaign call centre, whether it was the organisation of the massive convention and public rallies in the course of the campaign. And then over the next 2 years, I continued to chair and lead the youth wing. Eventually, we took a drug pull testing remit to the party's conference and managed to achieve a U-turn on the party's position, which was quite an achievement.
That was quite remarkable. That was quite achieved, and really, I really congratulate for you to step up on that completely U-turn and completely against the wishes of everyone, but also recognizing your contribution towards that, I believe, has been paid off.
I think we were about as surprised as everyone else when that remit passed, but I think what it showed is how democracy can and should work. Political parties are an important medium between the political powers, establishment and government of the day, and ordinary people. And I think we often forget that in order for our parliamentary system to work, those democratic parties need to be full of ordinary people making their voices heard. Because if you wait for one day out of 365 every 3 years, that level of engagement is never going to give you the social goods or social capital you can really get out of a participatory democracy. So that was that moment in which young members of New Zealand First stood up to the party and challenged their perspective on drug pull testing. Really demonstrated how democracy can work, should work, and how you get the best possible outcome, which is when ordinary people sink their teeth into the political establishment and say, hang on a minute, I'm a voter, I'm a member, I'm an activist, and you're going to need to listen to our voice too when you make these decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. But the first step is how you make the youth come and actually raise your voice. So you were dragged, and I believe that's one of the key things, that you need to drag more people, and this is where how the chain will work, isn't it? To be honest.
Absolutely. So, and just to touch on that, I say dragged kicking and screaming, but I was already quite political. So my father was a activist against the Springbok Tour in 1981. He was treasurer in the 70s for a small time for the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. He's always had a very strong civil libertarian in terms of human rights and social justice. So both of my parents were quite political people, and it definitely left an impression. So it was definitely fertile ground. But what it took was someone saying, "Hey, why don't you take a side, not just a sideline?" And I think that's the difference. In order to get people politically involved, you really have to grab a hold of them and say, "Look, here's this opportunity to affect the outcome. Do you want to be a part of this or not?" Because otherwise, a lot of people will simply let things go by the by, even though they have a huge amount they could otherwise be contributing.
I agree totally, because you can only get those outcomes, whether it is positive or negative. But the positive outcomes, if you want to do and you have your vision, then you have to get in, isn't that basically?
Yeah.
And
Shane Jones has a saying, which is, if you don't have a seat at the table, you're going to be on the menu.
That's so true. Absolutely. I agree with that. Yeah, no, fantastic. No, that's a colorful and a multi-talented, but also your background, now that I know your background also is a little bit of, we can call it, the genes are there. The political seeds of genes are already in you, which is good to know. But it is taking that first step of little to make the difference and see that you are one of them, and it is affecting you and it is affecting around you, of whatever these political people or the government was taking. And I don't call it politics, because I always call it social service. This is a social service for everyone, and that we humans are here only to serve humans, and in any either shape or form. We just serve people, really speaking, in reality, in my spirituality world. So yeah, now, so let's see, and it's quite interesting. Like, I wanted to do this future proofing of nation, to tell everyone to think on that, rather than thinking on just color of the party or just a party politics. Party politics doesn't take you far. It just takes you over the, what you call it, the covering of the term of the political event. But term can finish, people come and people go, the term finishes. But it's the content that you create, and it's the legacy that you create is quite, to me, the nation is recognized and acknowledged around the world. So let's get into one of those few topics that I have chosen today, and to see what will be your visions around that. So the first one, since you touched on the human rights and your background also seems to be, let's see, what do you think the human rights has affected or has been impacted with this COVID-19? Do you think we need to change some of the traditions or some of the norms of the human rights, or in terms of your view? Or
Yeah, so I guess the question is sort of twofold. One is about, so human rights as a term is sometimes a little bit problematic, because really we should just be talking about rights and leaving that word. But over the past 40 years, there's been a discourse that's developed, which is, what about the economic rights? What about the economic rights of the person, the social rights, the cultural rights, the legal rights? And while these things might have the same moral worth, it sort of dilutes the word rights. And what's happened is there's been this division between people who go, you have a right to life and a right to freedom of expression. And these are obviously usually what we call negative rights. Your right to do things without other interference. And that's fairly uncontroversial, except within a few small debates. And then there's the more positive rights. And obviously this is where we get that other kind of liberalism, or that other kind of perspective. And that's when things get to be a bit more heated. And I think that's the biggest controversy around human rights. And that positive right is, it might be that positive right for a person from another country to come and move to New Zealand and settle here, or seek refuge here. It might be that positive right to every person in New Zealand to own a home. That positive right for a member of the Indigenous community to self-express their identity and find expression in the institutions of this country. And it's when we get to those positive rights that things become a little bit more stable, because they're less well-defined and there's a lot less consensus. The point I would make is this. Often we use the language of human rights to put on a pedestal and sanctify those political objectives we otherwise can't achieve. And I don't think it's always the right way to go. You don't need the word human rights to achieve some of the economic goals we have. For example, no one necessarily has a right to a job, but the aspiration of a society with meaningful full-time employment isn't any less worthy. You don't necessarily, I'm not necessarily born with a right to own a home. You might have a right to shelter, but you don't necessarily have a right to home ownership. But it doesn't mean that the goal of assisting people into home ownership, which is a huge step in leveling social equality, isn't worthy. So I think often people on the political left resort to the language of human rights to beef up their political goals and objectives, but actually it isn't necessarily necessary. And I think some of the things they aspire for, which is, you know, the right to everyone for health, a healthy, affordable, high quality home, access to high quality healthcare, first world jobs and first world wages. We don't necessarily need to talk about these in the language of human rights.
Yeah, no,
we can use a different language. And for me, as a New Zealand firster, there's always been this language of nationalism, not nationalism from a place of hate or exclusion, but nationalism from a place of love and compassion for everyone who's a member of a family called Aotearoa New Zealand. And it's this idea of a nation where everyone owns that, where the family unit, families own their homes, they have a good high income to support their children, they have access to high quality healthcare, and they have access to educational advancement, which is the great leveler. And none of those things necessarily need to be rights, but we can sanctify those aspirations as a society because we believe it's such an important social good. The state should get involved in society, in the economy, in order to guarantee these things.
Is it because that the world human rights or the world has dictated, one of the main organization who is saying that we have to report, like the United Nations or the World Health Organization has been formed and every country has to follow that kind of norm? Is it high time in your world that every country should have their own kind of constitution around the rights or around the human rights? Do you think, is it high time? Because with COVID-19, I think what has happened, people have started talking about human rights when they say, okay, when there is a voice for children or voice for child poverty or voice for that kind of thing, and then they say, oh, you are entitled or you have the right to do this. But then in that, as you rightly said, right to freedom, so people are negatively taking the right to freedom to a larger extent. And we saw some of the protests we saw during the COVID-19, which was not really called for, but that's how they have expressed their right? So I totally get your point, but is it in your view that going forward now that COVID-19 is going to be here for some time, I believe, and so these things will pop up each time, every time that people will say that you are dictating to me or you're not giving me the right to do this and do that. And so what do you think in your view that way?
So I think there's a really interesting point you raised before about the role of international organizations like the United Nations, like the World Health Organization, the United Nations Convention for the Rights of Children, that play in the process of it. So on the one hand, it's kind of good to have an international watchdog because ideally or theoretically, they're supposed to be impartial, unbiased. Of course, we know that the international politics of the world mean it's not always quite that simple.
No, it's not simple.
But the idea of having someone outside nations commenting and talking about and discussing human rights, there is a lot of value in that. I think there's a division happening in the world in terms of our approach to issues, and that's between globalism and nationalism. And globalism says that we need an international government or framework or enforcement in order to address some of the massive issues because they are across borders. And those are issues like climate change, issues like mass migration of people or refugees, war or international conflicts, and of course, most recently, COVID. And then there's another camp, which is the nationalist camp. And that camp says, actually, no, the only person who should be tackling these issues is the sovereign nation state acting on behalf of typically a democratic population, but sometimes it's just assumed that it has the will of the people in the case of, say, China or other authoritarian states. Now, we have to remember, even though there's the divide there, it's not that black and white, and there's a spectrum of opinion. For example, New Zealand First, whilst being a patriotic nationalist party, we do recognise the role that the UN has, and we do recognise that we have an international role. as New Zealand, especially as kaitiakitanga or guardians within our South Pacific region. Because let's be honest, at the end of the day, no one else is going to do that job. So there's a balance. I think when it comes to human rights, we are generally a good and responsible signatory to many of those treaties, but the problem becomes one person's perspective on human rights in The Hague in the Netherlands, where the UN is based, is not necessarily going to translate into the real conditions of New Zealand. The example I'd use is on the rights of a child. For example, were it up to the UN, no child under the age of 18 would be able to take full-time work. And that's one instance where we haven't fully ratified, and we've sought an exemption to that convention as New Zealand. And that's something that Minister for Children Tracy Martin has been a strong advocate for, because in New Zealand, actually, it's very typical and it's very normal for a young person under the age of 18 to seek employment because they're working on the local dairy farm, they're working at the mum and pop shop. Actually, the idea of a young person under the age of 18, as young as 14 and less, working in the holidays, working after school, in either the family business or the family farm is actually quite normal, and it's a part of our culture. So that's one of those situations where there's a balance between the Indigenous experience and culture of a country that we have and its uniqueness, and the aspirations for this kind of universal framework of rights. And I think it's all about finding the balance between the two, because just because we have our own way of doing things in New Zealand doesn't mean that, you know,
it's right
basic
or wrong.
human rights, freedom of religion. Well, there's no situation I can imagine where New Zealand goes, actually, we're going to do away with freedom of religion and we're going to become some kind of Christian theocratic state. I don't think any Kiwi would get behind that. And in fact, much of the aspirations within the United Nations human rights discourse and framework can actually be found quite deep within the psyche of New Zealand. For example, we're a very secular country. Doesn't mean we're not religious, but we definitely, there's a consensus that the state should be agnostic. The state doesn't take part in theological or theoretical or religious debates of doctrine. It'll defend your right to religion, and naturally some of our laws will be informed by values that will be informed by Christian or Islamic or Judaic or Greek or Roman philosophical perspectives. But when it comes to the division between church and state, there's a huge consensus there. I think there's always going to be a role for international bodies to regulate but not enforce, because I am a nationalist, and I do believe that the most effective form of social and political organization is that natural, organic community we find in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Very well-defined borders because we're surrounded by an ocean. We're becoming, it's not rigid or concrete what a Kiwi is, but we're becoming more defined in ourselves as a nation. And I think while there's a place for that outside perspective on universal human rights, ultimately, the most effective way we will see human rights enforced, regulated, and monitored is actually for our own organic expression of those as aspirations as an independent sovereign people.
Yeah, like some of the what I noticed during the COVID-19 and some of the policies that you were trying to what NZ First was trying to do was, I like to a large extent, I agreed, was first look after our own people, which are within the vicinity of our nation, rather than with this situation concentrating and looking after more on the overseas side of things. And so we wanted to make sure that everybody is employed, everybody locally who is there should be employed and should get that first right, which was quite obvious and quite correct in that sense. But then what happens to those rights which are not directly but indirectly still contribute towards the nation, and what do we do with those ones? And that was a fine line which I saw was a debatable thing for many of the people, that all of a sudden they noticed. But pre-COVID, they were all complacent about it. And that's one of the things which I found, that we were too complacent before COVID-19, not trying to improve things the way, and not trying to get ready for situations like this, where we would face from time to time this kind of situations, and we had to be prepared for it. And this is where my thing was, how do we future proof these things are going to continue, and we need people, but we need people first to be looked after who we are inside, within our country. That's one thing which was the right, and that everybody should get in terms of that. And then the other thing which I saw was, how do you mitigate between when the kids were, like I heard stories in the South Auckland where the kids are supposed to like work for to help the parents from the school, and that was not, whether that is a right or whether it is acceptable or allowable is a big question,
Yeah. So if I could just touch on that point quickly, there's a big
Yeah.
difference between what I was talking with about the legal ability for young
Mm,
people under 18 to be able to
mm,
work on their family farm or their family business,
mhm.
and the economic situation of those children who are
Mm.
forced by circumstance
Yeah.
to have to
Yeah.
work and support their families. And there's a big difference between those two. But I think we're probably going to end up touching on that when we start to talk about child poverty, because
Yes, yeah, exactly. That's
yeah,
our next topic anyway.
fantastic.
We'll come around that topic when we do the child poverty very soon. Next one, we will be looking at the child poverty, because human rights, after human rights, I think my heart goes to those kids of this generation who are born today, who will be our future generation and the coming generation. For them, we need to make sure that the future proofing has to be there now, and we have to take decisions now for them. So no, that's great, but it was a good insight on the human rights aspect that you touched on very few things, which is very quite overview giving, and giving your visions was quite promptly the way I wanted to see that happening with the younger generation, understanding the whole complexity of this. So no, thanks. Okay, thank you, Rob. Now let's go to the next topic, which is child poverty. So child poverty pre-COVID and post-COVID, or during now, very much it got accepted or acknowledged only recently, I would say, which is when you guys came in coalition, and that's where it was identified and acknowledged. So child poverty is a big thing at the moment, and we heard stories of like, okay, free lunches has been talked about, uniform cost of kids has been talked about, affordability of parents cannot do that, it's been talked about. But really speaking, implementation is coming in now with the acknowledgement. So that's the first step, was acknowledgement. So how do you see now going forward this child poverty whole analysis, when you look at what will be your vision to make sure that we don't fall into this, or we don't at least expand or increase? So we need to put some, being a first world nation, my question is, being a first world nation, we need to future proof all these basic things of humans. And how do we do that? And what sort of measures do we put in place? What, according to you, one thing would be positively happening or should happen around this?
So I will answer that question because it basically gets to the nub of the issue. But before I address it, I really just want to dissect this term of
Okay.
child poverty. So the
Yeah.
term child poverty basically developed because within our society in New Zealand, the
Mm-hmm.
political capital associated with addressing poverty disintegrated. And some of that goes back to what happened in the 1990s around the
Mm-hmm.
demonisation of beneficiaries, and the way in
Right.
which those people
Yeah.
who have been long-term dependents on welfare have been
Mm.
demonised and stigmatised and marginalised. They haven't been able to get access to stable employment. And
Yeah.
in order to, and because there's a culture of, if you're raising the benefit, you're helping people who should be helping themselves, it created a
Mm.
huge barrier towards addressing the problem. So whenever we're talking about child poverty, we need to remember that there aren't these little
Mm.
children floating in a vacuum as if they were separate atoms existing in
Mm.
poverty. Actually, a child is poor because that family is poor, often because
Right.
that community is poor. And it
Mm.
doesn't just look like one poor family in a street. It can actually be a whole community, kaikoki, kawerau, that have been left behind over several decades because of the economic restructuring that happened in this country 30 years ago. And so the
Right.
difference in wealth might not just be between a household and a street, it can actually be between entire regional economies. For example, the difference between the Auckland economy and
Mm-hmm.
say an economy like Kaikohe or the Manawatu is actually as great as the difference between big economies like France and basket case economies like Greece or Cyprus. So that kind of
Yeah.
puts it into perspective, because that overall economic framework is a large part of what we're talking about when we're talking about poverty. So the first thing is, when we're talking about it, often we saw this debate this year where National Party was attacking Labour because there's 20,000 people more in poverty, and Labour Party saying, no, on our measure, it's this much. For me, the easiest way to talk about this is just say, what is it? It's material hardship. It is being without certain things. And we can talk about how the parents are making bad choices, or they're doing this thing or the wrong thing. But in order to change that, which we might need to, that's going to take much longer than overnight. However, to address that material hardship that child is currently dealing with, that will create damage that will last for lasting years and generations, we can actually do something about that now. And that's where that school lunches and schools program was really important. So the baseline to address these things in the immediate term, to address material hardship in New Zealand, is the basic, universal basic provision of services, whether it's healthcare, education, or housing. And on those three margins, we used to do that really well as a country. And every time New Zealand first gets into government, we tend to beef up our healthcare, whether it's free doctor's visits for children under the age of 14, whether it's being able to rent to buy housing. So those universal basic provision of services is a huge part of dealing with the material hardship factor. But there's another side of it. And I think in order to future-proof the ability of New Zealanders, every New Zealander, and therefore every child to live a flourishing life, we've got to address two things. One is housing and one is income. So I'm going to talk about housing first, because that's an even less immediate, but more of a medium-term fix. So the average household spends about 2/3 of its income on housing. And while there was an institutionalized group of poverty in New Zealand since the 90s, as the housing crisis worsened, so did the number of low-income families. So the way it tends to work is you got the quite hard out, very, very poor down here. Then you got the working poor, low-income families, and they're generally fine until there's an economic shock, whether it's COVID or a global financial crisis. And then all these people who are sort of above the poverty line, whether because it's job loss or cuts in hours, or a car breaks down, or they suffer an economic shock to their income, or they have a cost come at them, they start to slip below. And that housing crisis was a large part of it. So one of the key ways we can ensure those struggling families have a much better future for themselves is by getting them into home ownership. Because at the moment, whilst none of them have enough
money,
none of those people have enough income to put down a deposit for a home and service a mortgage, they can in fact service the rent. And you get this contradiction where they're paying this much in rent, that if you took all of that together and lumped it together, there's their deposit, and they have the income to service the mortgage. So one of the ways New Zealand First would basically bring back what was the universal family benefit. And the way you get buy-in for a policy like that is you make it universal, because just because you have rich parents or poor parents doesn't mean you're going to be richer or poorer. And actually, I dislike this classist way we view things, because in any given life, you might be, there will be times when you're poor and times when you're rich.
And never same. No humans are going to be same. No situation is going to be the same. I believe in that concept too. Very much, I believe.
There'll be times when you're in poverty. There'll be times when you're on struggle street. There'll be other times when you're doing very well. And a universal family benefit, which is a lump sum on the first child up to the fourth, it gets a little bit less each time, but every single family is the best possible way to address the variety of economic circumstances. That's not the best thing about the policy. The best thing about the universal family benefit policy is that you can capitalize that benefit in order to put a lump sum deposit on a home. That's the kicker. That's what's going to get families into home ownership. That's what's going to give them a degree of economic stability and certainty of tenancy, certainty of lease, a place to live, put down their roots as a community, and for the children. And so that's one massive thing we could do tomorrow to increase the long-term prosperity of those lower and lower middle income families.
And we did had this UB Universal Basic in 1946, I think,
Yep.
believe, right?
Yep.
And then after that, it was stopped in 1990 something or 1991,
Yeah.
which was. But that's a good thing that what you're saying. I want to ask you too with regard to these two questions. One, does population that has increased since over the period of time has contributing factor in your view? Or in the second one, the pre-existing cost that we have got for housing, for mortgage, for rents or whatever, and there is no regulation. It's a freedom of person charging. There is no like a fixed standard rate. Whatever person wants to charge, they just charge according to the to meet the obligations of the bank and just do that. Do you think that these two things now should be regulated or should be something to be done around this area to avoid, to minimize the cost? Yes, one way UB is going to be good, but that's fixing to some extent. But with the existing pre-COVID, then we are compromising that whatever existing cost it is we are accepting that that's a correct cost or that's a
Yeah.
norm that we have
Yeah.
accepted. Do you think that it should also be looked at, the existing costs that are already associated with this kind of what you just now highlighted?
Yeah.
Um,
So this
mm,
this is a really interesting part of the debate because it
mm,
gets to the fundamental question
mm,
is the price we are currently paying for housing a
mm.
fair price, a just price?
Yeah,
And rather
exactly.
than
Mm,
subsidizing that cost and that price for a
correct.
policy like universal family
Mm,
benefit,
mm,
wouldn't it be better to put in controls on the market to stop
correct. Yeah.
the level of price gouging that we see?
Mm.
But this gets quite complicated because
Yeah.
Um, first of all, no, markets don't exist in a vacuum. So the
Mm,
backroom to this is a selling off of state houses, a
mhm,
very unsustainable population policy in Auckland where growth
mhm.
was about 11, growth of population was 11% per year, but house
Right.
building was 5%.
Right.
The outdatedness of our tenancy and rental laws in terms of the rights of tenants
Mhm,
and a state housing stock that had been driven under and under and under.
mhm.
So all of these things, plus a rental market
Yeah.
that had been very much left to private owners,
Yeah.
that's a part of why those prices are. I would resist the idea of putting in rent freezes or rent controls because when you intervene in a market, you can often have unintended consequences, and you have to
Yeah.
look at what exactly is driving the price of that
Mm,
rent, because you get
mm.
into very dangerous territory when you start to dictate to people what the
Yeah.
minimum price of something is. We already do this with minimum wage, but there are
Yes.
reasons for that because what we are saying
Mm.
is there is a minimum price you can attach to the price to a person
Yeah.
before they um, before they start work. We're basically saying we're protecting the integrity of a person's labor to
Mm,
disallow exploitation.
mm,
Now,
mm,
you could put that same argument into the case of housing, but at
mm,
the same time, we actually want the private rental sector to be
mhm,
competitive, to do well, and we
mhm.
want to let price signals determine behavior to a degree because
Right.
actually the
Mhm.
minimum price for a person living in the city is
Yeah.
going to be different for the minimum price of a person living in West Auckland.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And if we say, well, the baseline is 500,
Mm,
what you might find is a whole lot of private landlords around Auckland Central saying, well, that's not competitive. I'm going to change my land use. Are you
mm,
then going to say, after creating that distortion, well, no, 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 we're going to restrict the way you use that rental property? Because they might say, well, if I can't rent it out residentially, I'm going to
mm,
rent it out for more profit commercially. Are
mm,
you going to then pass a law to stop that? And
mm,
so on and so forth. So that's the problem when we just go for a very blunt tool like a rent control.
mhm,
However, what
mhm,
we can do is create a much more social and
mm,
just market,
mm,
not outside but next to the rental property sector, which helps in lowering
mm,
that level of competition. And that means um, competitive loans to local government for social
mm,
housing at rates of
mm,
2%. It means a
mm.
state housing
Yeah.
commission, which
Yeah.
is responsible for the planning and regulation of those state houses.
Mm,
So boosting that state housing stock to
mm,
provide for those low income families,
mm.
to get them into home ownership. along with a much more sustainable rate of population growth, these are things that will take a lot of the heat out of the housing market as it exists, because the problems associated with the rental market are also downstream effects of the lack of home ownership in a whole lot of families across Auckland. And I'm just talking from an Auckland perspective, because this is where I'm from and
understand
where my people are affected, and it's what I understand the most. But we can't just view the rental market and what's gone wrong with the rental market in a vacuum and then prescribe policy options on top of that. The discussion around what a fair rental market price looks like is actually part of a conversation about what's gone wrong with the state and community housing providers, what's gone wrong with construction costs, what's gone wrong with the price of land, and what's gone wrong with the tax incentives around property. By addressing all these different issues, we will create a much more fair and just housing market, but also opportunities for home ownership.
So
whilst I wouldn't rule it out, I don't think that rent controls or rent freezes are necessarily the way we achieve the outcomes we want.
But do you think like this, you touched on that, and I was just thinking, and back of my mind, I was thinking, if you can introduce UB to minimize the child poverty, and you rightly said the basic fundamental core is not just band-aiding the child poverty, but actually healing from the core, which is the housing and everything. So just like the UB, can you not suggest, like, what would you think the land rates, the location of the property and everything that at the moment is happening, and people are charging and pricing the rent accordingly? Do you think there should be like a standard, a land is a land, a location is a location, and it shouldn't really determine the price of the rent? Do you think that thing should come along now as a basic thing?
So let's just touch on a few issues there. So one is, because I guess in one way the question you're asking is, who should determine the price of a property for rental or otherwise? And generally, it should be the market. So I'm not, and this is the conversation we had 100 years ago, which is, what is the most productive and efficient way of producing those goods that we want, those goods and services we want? And generally, it's capitalism. Generally, but capitalism as a system is amoral. It's not good or evil. It's not anything in particular. It's completely amoral. It's all about profit and the most efficient way of driving that. But in order to get the social outcomes we want, the state needs to put particular guarantees. I think we have a special scenario in New Zealand, especially in the case of Auckland as an isthmus, because of the way it's developed and because of the way it's grown, and because of the metropolitan urban boundary and what that has done to land prices. The cost of purchasing a home, a house, is actually far less. So part of the reason for prices as they are is around exactly what you said, land. When I'm talking about renting, it's a little bit different, because we're talking about location, if that makes sense. So part of what's driving the cost of housing is the price of land. And some of that, and that speculative property bubble we've created, is what's driving up renting. But there's two separate things here. I don't think we need the state to determine the price of renting locations, but there's a much deeper conversation to be had long term, especially in the case of Auckland, about what land ownership looks like. Because in countries like Singapore, they actually divorce the two. And in cities like Germany, they've actually divorced the two. You can't own freehold land in a lot of places in those countries, but you can own your own home. So what's that done is it's divorced land property speculation out of the housing market. And so you're actually just purchasing the home. And so I think putting forward a solution like that would be a very contentious thing in a country like New Zealand that prides itself on being a property owning democracy. But in a place like Auckland, it's probably time we had a conversation like that. Whether or not our current model of land ownership is partly responsible for the speculative bubble we've created. Because actually, no nation ever got wealthy selling houses to one another. And we see that more clearly than ever. And I think that discussion is probably the next step for a place like Auckland, which is whether or not the current model of land ownership is creating a fair and just housing market.
Yeah, to me, housing never ever should be considered as a business model or as a product to be made profit on it.
I
I don't know what's your view, but my view is like housing is to live and should not be considered as a commodity for buying and selling and determining the discrimination between people. And it creates a lot of hell of a lot of competition amongst people. And then which area you live and what price of your value of your house. So on paper, your value would be this, but it's at the end of the day, whoever
Yeah.
wants to buy, it's their affordability. And I
I,
heard,
I, so if I could just jump
ask,
in there,
yeah,
I hear what you're saying.
mm,
The problem is if we
mm,
say, well, housing shouldn't be, I mean, in the same way that you can say housing, like the
mhm,
provision of housing shouldn't be a for-profit activity or a business activity, you could
mhm,
also say something as essential as food shouldn't
mhm.
be a for-profit or business activity. But actually, what we've learned in the past 100 years in terms of economic models is that,
Basic
ironically,
thing.
the
Mm,
for-profit
yeah.
capitalist model is the most efficient way of producing that food. So what we can do is we can
Mm,
have an efficient profit model for producing a good, and
mhm,
then have a layer of regulation, be it state housing, be it rent to buy, be it regulations around tenancy rights, to regulate the profit after it has been made. Because if
mm,
we're not going to develop, if we're not going to have the production and a housing market
mhm,
run by business, then
mhm,
who's going to run it? And if it's by the government or by local government, that doesn't always give us the outcomes we want because,
mhm.
let's be quite frank, governments and local councils don't always get things right either. It's
Yep.
always going to be a mixed model. So I would say, yes, housing can be a business commodity, but that
Mhm,
can exist alongside the concrete, ironclad social guarantee that every
mm,
person in this country will have a pathway to home ownership,
mm,
whatever that looks like, and have the provision of shelter and housing.
mm, mm. Because no, but that's good, your visions, and it's good to know that what the younger generation wants to have a house or own a house, and how do we get fast track that? How do you future proof that with the existing conditions that we are into? And people have got the ability to do a lot of things. However, people don't have yet the ability to own the house because of the pricing that it is. And to make that or to come to that, we have seen generations even up till now. We have seen at a younger, it's very rare. Some very few people, younger generation, are getting into that ladder of buying a house on until you buy a house, until you save a deposit, it's your already 40, 50, and then you got half of your journey is finished kind of. And so when do you enjoy that housing? When you want the young, when you are young and you want to have own your own home. So that's where my point was, like, because of the housing is been treated as a profit making. So people who have been into the business, people who have been into that age group, matured enough, have got saved up enough, only they are got the ability to buy and sell. And that's where my point is, how do we control that? But
So
no, I take your point as well.
yeah,
Yeah, that
I think there was one thing. So I mentioned housing before, and what I've often found
mm,
in discussions about poverty. So I spoke
mm,
at the Child Poverty Action Group, and
right.
despite being about child poverty, most of the
Mm.
conversation ended up being about housing, and
Oh,
that
okay.
means that we can sometimes miss the big picture because there's the other side of poverty, which is this:
Mm,
incomes,
mm,
incomes. How much
mm,
wealth and income a family has to not only provide the basics, but also
mm,
just a nice life. And
mm,
that's been the biggest reason because we used to be a high cost because of our geographic position and a high
yeah,
income society, a high wage society. And they sort of
yeah,
cancelled
yeah.
each other out. The problem now is
Mm,
we're just as costly, we have as high a cost of living as before, but because we
mm,
are a less equal and less productive country, we're now
mm,
also a low wage economy. And
mm,
that's the biggest issue. If we want
mm,
to reduce poverty in New Zealand, we need to
mm,
raise incomes and raise wages in a meaningful way. And it doesn't
mm.
mean on paper. It means the purchasing power for each dollar a
Purchasing
person
power.
has.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
that comes back
100%
to a
agree.
discussion about raising the
Mm,
productivity of New Zealand and by
mm, mm.
extension, raising the
Yeah,
wages of people across New Zealand. And for me,
yeah.
that's probably one of the biggest reasons for supporting New Zealand First because it's the only
Mm,
political party that takes a much more pragmatic to the way we grow our economy. And going back
mm,
to the example of Taiwan and Singapore and South Korea,
yeah, Yeah.
Actually, economic growth and development can't just be left to the market. The state can actually have a navigating role in that journey towards a high wage, high productivity,
Mhm.
high growth
Mhm.
economy, high value. And
Mm.
it's in that
Yeah.
scenario where the purchasing power and wages and incomes of people are lifted.
Mm.
That is the biggest long-term ability to either
Reduce.
end or dramatically reduce poverty. It is
I
when
agree.
those people and those
Mm.
families
Mm.
accumulate
Mm.
wealth,
Mm.
whether it's the asset of a home ownership, whether it's shares and dividends, or
Mm.
those high incomes,
Mhm.
that we will see the economic emancipation of a section of
Mm.
the population that for 30 years has
Mm.
either been left behind or written off.
Yeah, right. No, well said, well said. That's exactly what we have to combine the whole thing to reduce or to eliminate child poverty. Income is the key factor, driving force. Thanks very much. Let's go back to the next question, which is also quite important for me and as a business, like small businesses or businesses in New Zealand after COVID-19. The economy fairly depends on we being almost 90-95% are self-employed or small SMEs. And with the COVID-19, I've got a one similar to what we were discussing before and how complacent we were before this COVID-19 and now after COVID-19, what we need to change drastically and change not future but now is the again comes back to the existing cost of lease cost of the commercial leases. The businesses are not that bad in terms of jumping up or having a jump start once again to reboost. Restaurants, hotels, everything will start. Yes, overseas dependency was there. It's not going to be there. We were a tourist country, we were a tourist nation, and we understand that. But locally, the killer is still the commercial lease cost, which I feel is driving the businesses to close down rather than not having a business. People still want to go to restaurants, but the restaurant owner now is not able to afford what it was able to afford pre-COVID, the existing costs. Do you think these existing costs needs to be looked at rather than giving support to businesses by business loans or wage subsidy and things like that? Do you also think the existing costs to be looked at, particularly the ongoing fixed cost of businesses? And how
Okay,
do we future-proof this?
that's a really fascinating question, which is the role of, yeah, basically the cost of location on a small business. So
Yeah.
if you're a much larger business, then you've got a much larger capital base to work off.
Mm,
So you're in a much better position. But if you're a small to medium sized enterprise, then that commercial
mm,
lease can be a killer. So I know within my own family, both my father and my mother are both small business people.
mm,
So my father runs a small engineering workshop,
mm.
literally out of the downstairs workshop, and
Yeah,
my mother's
right.
both a singing teacher and a seamstress. So
Mm,
yeah, she's a dressmaker. Um,
mm.
and
Right.
the
Okay.
cost because their businesses are on such a small scale,
Mm.
it's highly prohibitive for them to rent out a shop space or rent out a shop front.
Correct.
But
Correct.
in and of that, that's also a good indication of whether you really need an
Mm.
entire dedicated commercial space for your business.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what we already see at the moment is this move within the business community towards a thing called shared spaces.
Mm.
So I would challenge, because let's remember, COVID is
Mm.
an opportunity to rethink the way we do business.
Exactly. That's where my question
Yep.
was.
And rethink the way we do work. So is the way forward for business, which is you save up the
Mm.
capital, you buy a chunk of commercial lease, you do all your
Mm-hmm.
pretty shop front, and
Mm-hmm.
for
Mm.
you know, almost, I mean, you think about of those shops that have a
Mm.
commercial lease, think about how
Mm.
many hours that shop
Mm.
front and that space isn't being used, and
Mm-hmm.
that
Yeah.
inefficiency is
Optimum
quite huge.
utilization of the
Yeah.
space. What you are
So
saying is correct.
yeah, so I think the future actually is
Mm-hmm.
a greater move towards shared spaces, communal
Yeah.
spaces, and the reason for
100%
that
agree.
is it
Mm.
drives down the cost of
Mm.
of um, of your location and your venue, and
Mm.
B, there's a greater ecology of businesses, because when
Mm.
you have
Mm.
your advertiser your marketing person,
Mm.
your salesperson, all those people within the same vicinity,
Mm.
it's much more, you get great more communication, great more synergy.
Mm.
And look,
Mm.
let's say, I mean, for some groups, it won't work. So if you're like Tyson Roofing, where I used to work, and you've got a big metal fabricator, you
Mm.
need a dedicated space. But
Mm.
it doesn't mean there can't be other groups that use other spaces within that factory for their own
Yeah.
production. And
Mm.
I think
Mm.
a move towards
Mm.
multi-client leases within the same property is possibly the
Yes.
way going forward. Because when it comes to when it comes to finding a property for a residential place of residence,
Mm.
we're
Mm-hmm.
absolutely okay with sharing
Mm.
that space with other people who are living there
Agreed.
permanently, semi-permanently at
Yeah.
least. So
Mm.
why is it
Mm.
with business we are so inflexible? We don't own
Mm.
the fact we don't own the place. We're
Mm.
simply renting it out, but we're the only person there. And for a
Mm.
large amount of that property's life, it's not
Mm.
actually being used. So I think a really fascinating way of possibly going forward in the future is asking the question is, do
Mm.
I need a permanent
Permanent. Yeah.
location in order
Yeah.
for me to do business?
Uh-huh.
Or can I get away with doing it at home or doing it online?
Mm.
And if I do need a commercial space,
Mm.
is that being utilized as well as it could be? Because
Yeah.
I'm only there for
Mm.
6 or 8 hours of the
Yeah,
day.
yeah, no, I agree. I see your point. And I think what you're suggesting is what we are operating at the moment. We see supermarkets and large commercial malls. They are operating under different businesses, but in the same area. But here you are also suggesting, which is like there are property owners who has got a bigger property and only part of that property has been utilized. And how do you utilize the rest of the part for other businesses who can work together? And then it also becomes powerful, I guess, from just from the branding and marketing and inter clientele point of view. It actually helps every business in that area, and same customers would like to have the same business from different things. So if there are three different products on that same premises and one person walks in, he will do something and he will buy all, or he may need all three, or he may need only one, or he may need both, and he doesn't have to go far,
Yeah.
which is a brilliant actually concept, shared spaces.
And
And
I'd
I
also
think,
say, if I could just jump in there, I'd also say there's a place for central and local government to be having a role in the development of those sorts of
all right,
facilities.
uh-huh.
So
Mhm.
I know that, so in Catalina Bay, there's exactly
Mhm.
this kind of shared space business office. And there's a whole lot of buildings around in my district in New Lynn, where they're
Mhm.
basically former industrial facilities. For example,
Mhm.
there's the old Nihitipu water treatment facility that used to pump
Right.
clean water around the Waitakere Ranges. That's
Mm.
now a class 2 heritage building, so technically it shouldn't be bulldozed down. It's fallen into
Mhm.
derelict, fallen into disrepair. It's sort of in the heart of the Woodlands Park Waima area. That would be a perfect place to take that
Mm.
building, which is publicly owned, give it
Yeah,
a new tender, give it a new look, redo the entire building, and turn it
absolutely,
into
100%.
either a
Mm.
visitor centre or a business community hub, because there are a large amount of people who are self-employed small business owners across West
Mhm.
Auckland. But oftentimes, the space they have in their home competes with their space they have for business. And I know that's definitely the case with my family.
Yeah, yeah.
But they don't have the capital as a business because of its
Mm.
scale to have a
Mm.
commercial lease on a full-time property. So
Correct.
having community-owned facilities like that
Mm.
create an ecology of small businesses and self-employed people is a really great way to refurbish and breathe new life into some of these old industrial buildings.
Right, right. No, I completely take your point. That's a great, brilliant point, what you touched on for moving forward for the small businesses to grow and to reduce the cost, existing cost as well. So they can jump back faster and the economy can be recovered faster. But the other question I had was with the small businesses, what will be, in your view, like supporting through business loans and things like that temporarily to fix up or to stand up the small businesses? Do you think that, because that support at the moment, according to me, is what's happening is going towards the cost of the existing. It's not going directly benefiting the businesses as such. Do you think there should be something else that for the small businesses and the self-employed, like for example the professionals like lawyers, accountants, doctors, basically who are operating from a premises, but all these mortgage brokers, accountants, lawyers, they are going to be dependent on the businesses. If the business is not there, the services also, they will be losing their business as well. So how do you future proof to make sure that the businesses stand so that these professional services also doesn't get affected? What will be
So
your stand?
yeah, so I think there's a really interesting point, and I'd just like to sort of go a little bit to the side of that question because it's the same discussion. When you're
Mm,
recovering as an economy, when you're encountering an economic shock, what is the
mm,
most fair, just, but also strategic and smart way to move
mhm.
forward? So there's a saying that my friend always says, which is, you shouldn't protect jobs, you should protect workers. And
Yeah.
what that means is,
Mhm,
rather than protecting a job, which may or may not actually be productive, may or may not actually be efficient, it may have been a payable
mhm,
task in the good times, but now
mhm,
there's been an economic shock and companies have chosen to cut down the fat. Actually, that wasn't the most efficient expenditure
mhm,
of money within that business. But
mhm,
so we might not want to save that job, but we should protect workers. So
mhm.
that's the key div, and it's the same with businesses. So even Margaret Thatcher, when she went through the Thatcherism and the neoliberalism in the UK, discovered
Yeah.
that it's much if you let businesses fail, it's much harder to restart them than it is to keep them going through the hard times. Because a
Mhm.
business isn't just a person. It is goodwill,
No,
it is the
but business.
networks, it's a clientele base, it's a brand that people know and recognize. So if I think about something like Tyson Roofing, if Tyson Roofing as a company was
Mhm,
allowed to die,
mhm,
that's 10 workers that instantly lose their jobs. That's a metal fabricator that's
mhm,
provides fabricator and flashings to a whole lot of builders across Auckland.
mhm,
It's a roofing company that does, on average, it's done thousands of roofs to a very high quality with a very good name. It takes on a whole lot of young people
mhm,
and otherwise low skilled workers and trains them up and upskills
mhm,
them. And so, if that business fails because of the costs incurred as a result of the economic shocks we have, we lose all of those things, all of those social and goods and social capital that isn't necessarily measured in the balance sheet of a business. So
mhm.
that's one of the
True.
reasons while we're going through this economic shock, it is very vital to make sure we keep that lifeline, that life support for businesses. But at the
Mhm,
same time, they need to be held accountable for their activities because they are private business owners who are in it
yeah.
to, get a little bit
Mhm,
ahead, to make themselves
mhm.
wealthy or for profit, or because they're passionate about what they do.
Yeah.
Now, the Labor Party wanted to create a business guarantee scheme, but it
Mhm,
had very low take up. So the
mhm.
small business loan scheme was a New Zealand first idea. So what it
Okay.
was about is, look, we're going to create this loan scheme in which you can take out a degree of money as a loan that you'll have to pay back. So on the one hand, there's accountability, but
Mhm,
two, we're going to make it below market levels of interest. And the first year, you don't have to begin repayment.
mhm.
And what that is, it's about making sure you've got this lifeline that all businesses can take up if they need to, should they have to. But at the
Yeah.
same time, you're still holding to them to account for their business investment decisions. Because
Mhm,
as you mentioned before, there were
mhm,
probably businesses whose
mhm.
economic model was not sustainable and
Yes,
was dependent
yes.
on
100%
disposable
agree.
incomes that
Yeah.
weren't necessarily there. And I
Mm,
think the big challenge we have in New Zealand is that a lot of our so-called wealth is a little bit illusory and it's dependent
mhm,
on private debt driven consumption. That actually, if you remove that away and the credit contracts in our economy, there's a lot of big spenders who aren't actually big spenders. There's a phrase that comes out of the Forbes magazine, which is the basically credit card billionaires or credit card millionaires
mm,
who off a salary of 120, 150, $180,000
mm.
leverage that income or an asset
Yeah.
to create a million or a million point five or $2 million
Mm,
in credit. So you
yeah.
start off with the asset or the income of 100,000
Mm,
and you increase it into this available credit of a million. Or if you
mm.
have that,
Yeah. Yeah.
750 income, you increase it to that credit of a billion. But
Mm,
the real wealth isn't actually there. And on a
mm,
much smaller scale, I think that's something that we have in New Zealand. I think it's
yeah.
something we haven't been honest about as a country.
Mm,
And
yeah.
you even see it in the way our government is currently borrowing
Mm,
money we don't actually have because we've slowly become less productive and less wealthy as a whole as a country. And
mm,
so overseas
mm,
borrowing has filled that gap where we won't raise taxes, but
mhm,
we don't want to borrow and we want to spend on a high quality healthcare system, and eventually one of those has to give. But underlying all of that is about building a more productive economy. So
Yeah.
going back to that issue around businesses, ultimately, because of the institutional role that small and medium firms have in our economy, we should try
Mm-hmm.
and do everything we can to keep that lifeline of support going. Whether they're self-employed, whether they employ 5 people, whether they employ 10. Because once that business fails, it's going to be much harder
Mm-hmm.
to
Mm-hmm.
bring back that social goods and capital. However, we need to do it in a way in which those people are still held responsible for their business decisions. And I think the
Sure.
small loans guarantee scheme, small business loan scheme, is probably the best possible way. Even if we
Mm.
expanded it to a degree, is the best possible way, because
Yeah.
otherwise there will be businesses that were not profitable, that were
Mm.
not sustainable,
Mm.
and therefore having a free for all
Mm.
simply means that we're subsidizing those businesses that may well have deserved to fail because of poor investment decision making. That small
100%.
business loan scheme is the really good balance between a
Mm.
lifeline support to make sure we hold on to the social capital and goods we get out of those small businesses, but at the
Mm-hmm.
same time hold people responsible for their investment
For
decisions.
the investments, yeah. No, very well said. I think that's a way forward to go. And I agree with that concept of definitely they need lifeline. Definitely they need to look at the viability of the business, and then only they can, that support is there so they know that they can do it and the viability is available for them to do, continue the business. So, but in some of the, because businesses are built on uncertainties, and now we are having on top of that economic uncertainty, and the government is stepping in to support those viable and businesses. So I take your point that some businesses would borrow loan and there is a social responsibility when they borrow, that their businesses needs to move, otherwise there is no point of doing that and they have to look into another area. So no, that's good. Thank you once again. That was great insight once again, Rob. It was good for the small businesses. So now coming back to the our next topic is essentials. Now, essentials, we saw during the COVID-19, essentials word popped up and people started realizing what is essential and what is non-essential. And some people argued and said that I am also comes under essential because I've been doing this for 20 years or 40 years. And then it was a good question for many people, like recreational was or basic, what is essential? But essentials like doctors, GPs, these are all, and the supermarkets and the police and the ambulance and everything, healthcare workers. But to me also essentials was farmers, which was not talked about much. And that is the producing of our local food and local drinks and food, which we are reliant every single day. And future proofing that in terms of your vision and your view, how would you see the government, or what in your view that we should be having a future proof policies or future looking after? Then if something goes wrong in farming industry, something goes wrong to the farmers, and if they are affected, then what is our backup plan? So what do we really start looking at least we should start the dialogue and have a conversation now than ever. Tell us something about that. How do we future proof the farming industry and the essentials of food industry?
Yeah.
So we are not dependent on overseas. Yes, we imports and exports are there, and that was not affected during COVID-19 much. In fact, it was quite good at that time. But what if it was the other way around? And this is where I am thinking.
Yeah, so it's a really
How do
interesting question. So when it comes to agriculture, we've always been dependent on our agricultural exports. As a country, many people don't really realize this, is that we don't actually have
mm,
the most fertile or arable land as a nation
mm,
across the world, because most of our land is actually in mountains. So what's left over
yes,
is best for
yes,
pastoral farming and for forestry. We're not a country that
yes.
produces a lot of monocultural high yield crops like wheat, and that makes us quite
Mm-hmm,
unique. With the
mm-hmm,
exception of
mm-hmm,
potentially Canterbury, and there's a few horticultural ventures out there for green leaf vegetables and certain
mm-hmm,
varieties of fruits. But as a whole, it's
mm-hmm,
really pastoral farming and forestry that we make our bread and our butter and
mm-hmm,
logs, so to speak.
mm-hmm,
I think we've done very well as a country recognizing the strategic need for both an export and domestic industry for food
mm-hmm,
production. And you can actually extend that logic a little bit further, as other countries done, in
Right.
terms of when we're thinking about where is our steel produced, where's our aluminium produced, where is our oil refined, where is our, and you can extend that conversation onwards. But
Mm-hmm.
sticking onto this discussion of primary production,
Mm-hmm.
because of economic policies in the 80s, and because of our declining rate of productivity, because of our place as a land resource dependent economy,
Mm-hmm.
we've basically locked ourselves into a business model that I don't think is sustainable, and that is intensive agriculture, i.e., intensive dairy farming across New Zealand. Now,
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't remove the importance of dairy. It contributes about $12.6 billion in export earnings and
Right.
17.6% of our economy. So it's
Mm-hmm.
extraordinarily vital. However, because of the way we do things in this country, we have locked ourselves into a business model that is trying to extract greater and greater products from our land
Mm-hmm.
um, that are becoming less and less despite us putting more and more in terms of inputs,
Mm-hmm.
be it technology, be it investment, and controversially, be it fertilizers. And now that's starting to have an impact on our waterways, our environment, not just in terms of climate change emissions, but also the way that runoff can damage waterway streams. And most farmers are actually recognizing that now. There's a conversation that often happens when we talk about dirty dairying or the impact of
Yeah.
farming that it has on land. But actually, some of
Mm-hmm.
the most environmentally aware and conscious people are those farmers. Very few farmers go into business not caring about the environment, not caring about the
Mm-hmm.
land, not having a conscious appreciation of how the land and the soil and the trees and the importance of planting trees to create a wind belt and wind protection for the farm,
Yeah.
the importance of having more than one crop growing on the soil to increase fertility and organic soil matter. And it's actually a good farmer is a farmer who's got clean waterways, who takes care of his local environment. It's the bottom percentage of
Mm-hmm.
farmers who are the worst offenders that are creating the most harm. And the reason they're creating harm is because they're locked into a low cost structure that's making them more and more economically desperate.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the problem. So because of our dependence on a raw commodity export in our agricultural sector that's becoming tighter and tighter at the margins, that's forcing people to make economic decisions that are ultimately worse off for the environment. And that in itself compromises our integrity as a food exporter and a food producer. Because if we poison
Right.
our waterways, or if we damage,
Yes. Yes.
if we wreck the soil content, we all lose out, including farmers.
Mm.
The best route forward is probably not increasing compliance cost on farmers as a whole, because at the moment they're already under a huge amount of strain. Um, but there needs to be a conversation about the value for money on the exports we create, because those are what create the profit margins for our farmers as they stand.
Mm.
In order for farming to move forward, it's going to come
Mm.
with the support, not the adversarial, of the central
Mm.
government. So there's a move at the moment among the Green Party, and they're talking about regenerative agriculture and how we're going to put X amount of money into regenerative agriculture consultants to go around and talk to farmers. The problem with this
Yeah.
policy is that if you look at regenerative agriculture, it talks about things like um, diversifying or using a diversified permaculture, i.e., the grass that's grown, and to increase
Mm-hmm.
organic soil matter. We already do that in New Zealand. It's called
Yeah.
clover-based pasture, and which traps nitrogen in the soil. We've been doing it for years. It talks about
Mm.
zero to minimal till. We generally don't do this as a country because we leave grass growing on the top of the field the entire all year round. Good farmers do anyway. So the problem is
Mm.
that the strongest advocates for
Mm-hmm.
changing the way we do dairying and farming also have
Mm-hmm.
typically the least expertise. Some of them, like Dr. Mike
Mm.
Joy, are very good environmental scientists and have a
Mm-hmm.
strong backing
Mm-hmm.
in that matter. But on the political field, some of the
Mm.
strongest advocates for change to dairying and farming also have the least
Yeah.
experience and expertise in that sector. The only
Right.
way we move forward as a country in the way we do smarter exports and smarter farming is by having
Mm-hmm.
farmers
Mm-hmm.
as a part of that conversation, and by getting New Zealanders to understand what that actually looks like. Because it used to be most of us came from farming or dairying communities, or we were involved in the food production stream. Nowadays, the greatest involvement the majority of New Zealanders have with food production is when they go to the supermarket. And because of that disconnect, they no longer understand the process and the
Yeah.
problems involved in food production. And that lack of
Yes.
understanding is what's driving the urban rural divide. And that's probably the most dangerous thing, because if we have an urban-rural divide in this country, we won't get the reform to our farming sector that we need. And at the same time, we end up demonizing a really important, vital section of our community, which is our farmers, dairy farmers, beef and lamb farmers, all of them.
Do you think farming, self-consumption for our own nation as a future proofing in terms of reducing our imports and concentrating more on exports, but reducing on basic food imports and making more available for our own people, nation as a consumption, so that we are not reliant when problems like COVID-19 comes or these things come, we are still self-sufficient in terms of the food consumption that we grow for ourselves, for our country. Do you think we should do something around that?
So I think generally we are fairly self-sufficient. There's just a few areas in which we've moved away from that. When we're talking about self-sufficiency, we have to recognize is that if we wanted efficiency, we would have located New Zealand in the middle of Europe or Africa or America, which has huge and abundant natural resources. Unfortunately, we decided to have a nation at the very end corner of the world outside every major supply chain. And that's the economic reality. We are the worst located affluent society in the world, arguably. And that's reflected in how we've developed as an economy. So it's a bad example because it's not necessarily an essential good, but we can never return to the day in which we had 27 television factories in New Zealand, because that's not what self-sufficiency looked like.
Correct.
But by having a strategic and smart export sector that gives us the export earnings we need to pay for the goods and services we require as a nation, that's what gives us the guarantee. COVID-19 has made us question some of the assumptions we made about globalization, but ultimately a more interconnected world is the future. And while we can produce a lot of things in New Zealand naturally, there are several things we can't, and actually we don't necessarily need to.
Exactly. Yeah, we don't need to compare with other countries. We are unique, every country.
Yeah, there's a lot of things. There's a lot of things we will and can produce, and in order to maintain that production, there will need to be a degree of the government giving guarantees or subsidies. So a good example is TY Smelting Point. A good example is Glenbrook Steel Mill, Kawerau Paper Mill. But as a whole, we do a good job at producing a variety of products that sustain our needs. But we can't ignore the fact that there will be areas where other countries are much better at producing them. And the reason they are much better at producing them is because they do have the competitive and comparative advantage that we as a nation will never enjoy. And that's okay, because if you go back to, say, the individual, me as an individual, I will have certain weaknesses and vices. And I can either become well-rounded and average at everything, or I can be really good at 1, 2, or 3 things that sets me above the rest. So if you're thinking about it in terms of, you know, the Olympics or in business, what makes a person or an organization or a team successful is that they really hone down and play to their strengths rather than trying to spend all their time accommodating for their weaknesses. As a nation, that's our way forward, is playing to our strengths as a high quality, high value, highly productive, highly intelligent and hardworking population that produces good quality goods and services that the rest of the world are clamoring for to pay for those things we ourselves can't produce. That is our way forward. And best analogy again is Singapore, because they don't have much in the way of resources. They're a small island in the middle, in a backwater country without a hinterland. When they developed as a nation, all the economic experts like Milton Friedman said, you're screwed. A nation needs a hinterland to develop. Well, Singapore proved them wrong. And there's a good test example for that. We're a little bit better off than them. We've got a large amount of land. We've got pastoral farming. We've got the ability for industry to expand in our major cities. But you do not need to be a self-sufficient island in the middle of nowhere to be successful. Not in this current age, but you can still be smart about what imports you guarantee for your people and what exports you guarantee for your people.
Exactly. No, that's well said, Rob. This is brilliant to see your visions around that. It's really, we need that kind of more people looking into these areas and trying to contribute towards that discussions that needs to happen now. So yeah, good. Then my final topic is aged care. Now, we talk about seniors, we talk about, winter energy payments and all those kind of things have happened nicely and it's happening. But we have only identified, in my view, more during the COVID-19 because of the health reasons that they were affected, or they could have been affected. That was the thought process going on with the World Health Organization telling every country. But in terms of New Zealand, in terms of our nation, Aotearoa, what do you think? We are generally quite very family oriented, very traditionally based country where we do have rest homes and facilities for these people. But in terms of the future proofing of these humans that we need to be looked after every single day and not just with this natural disaster, only then we realize we have to look after them. In terms of that, do you think there is a lot of lack or there is a gap between in or not disconnection between the younger generation with the seniors or with the older generation that needs to happen more? You think our facilities should be happening more around that, how we can engage people so that they are not isolated and they are not into a different basket treated as all the time? What would be your thoughts on that to go forward after
Yeah,
COVID?
that's a really good question,
Hmm.
because I think it's a very interesting situation we find ourselves as a country where
Hmm.
we have an increasingly aging population who are starting to
Yeah,
experience loneliness more and more. And in the
correct.
same sentence, we have a large group of young people who
Hmm.
experience problems with mental health, depression, and anxiety,
Correct.
with one of the
Correct.
worst youth suicide rates in the OECD, and who are
Hmm.
finding themselves not in employment, education, or training, and are finding themselves without any real serious guidance.
Hmm.
So, on the one
Hmm.
hand, you've got this older population over the
Hmm.
age of 65 who
Yes.
are retired, they're
Hmm.
lonely, and they're
Hmm.
bored. Because just
Hmm.
because you get older doesn't mean you're any less
Absolutely.
switched on or intelligent. And you've
Hmm.
got this wealth of institutional knowledge and experience that you could be sharing with the world. And we
Correct.
just leave that massive economic, I don't like
Correct.
calling people assets or capital, but
No.
that's what they are. There's this huge social capital in our older generation of
Hmm.
wisdom and experience
Hmm.
that they could be passing on. And at the same time, we've got this big, large section of young people who are like, I don't know what I
Hmm.
want to do with my life. I don't know
Hmm.
where I'm going. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to make decisions. I'm really lost and without
Hmm.
purpose. And social media has actually made that a whole lot worse off, because it's created this social pressure with being
Hmm.
certain, secure, and successful,
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
if, as a young person, if you don't have those things, it actually exacerbates that anxiety and it exacerbates that depression, because it holds up to you this unrealistic perception of where you should be in life. You know,
Yeah.
you might be a 21-year-old coming out of university struggling to find work, and you
Yeah.
see, you know, this 21-year-old who's on the Forbes 30 under 30, and you think to yourself, what am I doing wrong? And that's not healthy for that young person. And at the same time, you've got, you know, that this large section of the population. The other side of it is this: the
Hmm.
people who do own homes and the people who do have security of housing tend to be those
Hmm.
older people. The
Hmm.
people without secure
True.
tenancy and without secure
Yes.
housing tend to be our
Yes.
young people. Well, hang
Yes.
on a minute. What's what's going on here?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
So I think, as you can see where I'm going with this. So
Yes.
one
I
of the
I totally get
ways,
that.
yeah,
Hmm.
one of the
Hmm.
ways we can address a huge number of problems,
Hmm.
specifically affecting both our young people and our old people, is doing exactly what New Zealand First has done,
Hmm.
by getting rid of those stupid words like youth and seniors, because there are no seniors, there are no youth, there are
Absolutely.
grandparents, there
Yeah.
are parents, there are grandchildren, there are nieces, there
Correct.
are nephews.
Correct.
We don't exist as individuals, we exist
Yes.
in terms of our relationships to other people. And we need to remember and revitalize those relationships and the social wealth we get out of them. And part of that is reconnecting our people over 65 and our people under 30, be
Hmm.
it business mentoring, because there are a lot of business people over the age of 65 who are now retired, who don't need the
Hmm.
money, but would love to take a young entrepreneur or business person who wants to get into business and give them that wealth, that experience, and
Hmm.
that mentorship.
Hmm.
We've got a
Hmm.
large number of people over 65 who have spent the past 30, 40 years in the trades,
Hmm.
in roofing and plumbing, and know every trick and trade in the book. And then we've got a
Hmm.
whole lot of young people who are just entering that
Hmm.
industry for the first time.
Yeah.
So I think moving forward, and some of this work has already happened with the senior strategy and the Honourable Tracy Martin, But
Mm-hmm.
basically, we need both our councils and our central government and social enterprises to start seriously looking at how much
Mm-hmm.
um, how much we can be getting out of connecting our young people with our older people in terms of addressing the lack of education, the lack of direction, the lack of employment, because you've got one section of the population who are at the end of their lives, but have accumulated this huge amount of social capital in terms of their networks, their experience, and their knowledge.
Yeah. Mm.
And these young people who are hugely disadvantaged because of their
Mm.
lack of
Mm.
networks,
Yeah.
experience, and knowledge.
Experience. Yeah. Yeah.
And
I
you can
totally
actually,
get that.
and when that old person passes away, all of that knowledge and
That's a great
experience,
vision.
well, that tends to go with them, unless they've spent, the past 20 years of their life recording every moment with a VCR. So actually,
Mm.
um, a huge way to tap into the huge amount of social capital and goods that exist within our older community is to start
Mm.
creating a transfer of that to our younger people. Because
Yeah.
what I've learned in New Zealand first is those older people love
Mm.
seeing young people succeed because they see
Mm.
themselves succeeding through them again, through that young
Exactly.
person.
Exactly.
It's a really
They
amazing
want to.
experience.
They generally, I also experienced that in my view is like older people or older generation, and I don't call older or senior. And you rightly
Yeah,
touched on that. I really
yeah.
love that
I mean,
analogy when you
you
said
still can,
they are
you
not
still
senior.
can when you're talking about demographics because there's a reason we have
Mm.
these words to label and to
Yeah,
categorize information.
but
But when you're
grandfather,
in terms of politics,
grandmother,
exactly, exactly.
these are the high
Yeah,
values, and this is where you come positive. And then you know you're talking about positivity, but you are also making a positive change by just saying that grandfather and grandmother word. It's more powerful than seniors
yeah.
or older generation,
I
And
also, sorry, if I
totally
could just make one more point. I also think that as the aging population increases and the number of young people paying taxes to support superannuation, there's this growing
mm,
generational divide that some politicians are taking advantage of, and it's the way
mm,
in which being young has been put on a pedestal because you're young, you're good looking, you're handsome, you got your youth about you, and being old is seen as a disadvantage, almost as a
mm,
disability, almost as the
mm.
hindrance. And the
Yeah,
condition
yeah.
of being of age
Mm,
is
mm,
passed on to that human being to devalue them. And I think that's seriously wrong. And
yeah.
one of the challenges we have is to actually turn that perception around because to be old is to be valuable, to be young is to be
Yeah.
valuable. They're just two different stages of life. Both have equal
Mm,
value. And part of the
mm,
egalitarian vision of New Zealand First has always been whether you're rich or poor, or Māori or Pākehā, or old or young, you have
mm,
value, you have worth, you have a place and a role. And
mm,
the original conception of justice by the Greek philosopher Plato was justice isn't about you've done something wrong, I'm going to punish you. Justice is
mm,
about every single individual having a role within their society, having a place
mm,
within that greater family. And I think
mm,
having a greater connection between our young people and our old people and recognizing the mutual value of both is the best possible way forward for a more cohesive, more
mm.
coherent, and just a more happy society.
Yeah, no, I totally get that and totally agree with your vision. Really, it touched it will touch lots of people and lots of people when they understand the meaning of grandfather, grandmother, and auntie and uncles rather than calling them older generation or senior people, which
Yeah,
doesn't really detach them. It detaches them, and they think that it's like a identity crisis or a labeling of that, and that's what is not really working. But then in terms of the going forward, that's a good vision. I think that's a great thing, that how do we engage this older generation with the younger generation, and who are contributing towards the older generation for their for their well-being, for their living, and how do we compensate by their wisdom and experience and knowledge to pass on. And it will be a win-win situation if we bring them together. So there has to be some sort of mechanism or a process that you think can be laid down as a policy or as a regulation, that okay, this is how we are going to utilize this, and this is how we're going to engage them, so that they don't feel lonely and you don't feel mentally stressed or don't know what to do, because there are so many choices, but you need experience to guide you. And it doesn't matter whether they are your real grandfather or grandmother, but they are grandfather and grandmother of this nation. So why can't you just take all the experience that they can offer? But to do that is what is requires the policies or regulations to be done in that way? How do we engage this? Because I've seen in the rest homes, they also can't interact with each other. So if they don't have much devices to interact or whatever with the new digital platform, we need to do something on that front so they can get engaged among themselves within their own community, within their own vicinity, so they don't feel lonely, you know. So yeah, good. That's great. So any final point that you would like to comment on this whole future proofing of our nation, that we would like to continue these conversations in the future as well, Rob? So I would love to have you once again, because your visions
Oh,
are quite
anytime.
aligning to me, and thinking forward is the right time, and changing the way we are doing at this moment, rather than complacent about what we have been already doing. So we have to think strategically. You touched on very well on the child poverty stuff. I love it, and same as human rights, but aged care was a good example as well. And with the small businesses, we tend to do few things innovatively, so that all these small businesses don't fall into that non-growth, which they have to grow. And to grow, they have to, as you said rightly, that support is there, but then viability of the business has to be. But I think you made the touch point, because this business, everything relates, goes back to the aged care, which is, we should utilize this wisdom, we should utilize their skills, we should utilize their experience to all of this, I think. Just like the children go for a walk in the park, I think when you become senior or old, or grandfather and grandmother, I don't call senior old now, I will use the word grandfather. I love that. Grandfather and grandmother. They need also to walk and go in the park during that time with taking the grandchildren and granddaughters. So how do we make that transition a reality is a question. So yeah, thanks very much, Rob. And so tell me something in the end, what you want to say about this.
So
What?
I think I might just as a final word, I won't really talk about policy or politics or
No,
anything.
no, no,
I
no.
just want to I want to recognize just how wonderful this experience on this interview has been, in contrast
Mm,
to other panels, debates that I've
mhm.
been a part of or watched. I think one of the major problem with our democracy at the moment is that
Yeah,
I just watch the minor parties leaders debate, and
yeah, yeah.
all the questions, it's 30 seconds for some of the most
Hmm.
challenging, complex, and
Hmm.
seemingly intractable policy problems of our time.
Hmm.
It's typically about the politics, not the issue. So
Mm.
they're asking Winston Peters about his polling, about the SFO investigation, about
Yeah.
isn't your party racist, about
I-
basically distractions. They're selling the
Basically,
internal conflicts within politics for views and
yeah.
sensation. What it does is it leaves behind those really important policy issues and decisions.
Mm.
For example, I want to see, if we want to talk about child poverty or poverty in general, isn't
Mm.
it much better to have a nuanced discussion between like me and a Green Party person? They might believe in
Correct.
rent freezes and rent controls, but what we
Yes.
do is we have this discussion where I've got a very different opinion, so do they, and we
Yeah.
interrogate each other's perspectives and values and opinions, even though we both really seriously care about the problem. And I think the
Mm.
forum that you've provided today is exactly the antidote to what's gone wrong in a lot of our democracy. The media has
Mm.
tended towards sensationalizing the issues,
Yes.
sensationalizing the popular
Sensational.
politicians in order to get ratings and views. And while
Mm.
it attracts the lowest common denominator in terms of
Mm.
watching an attention span, it does a huge disservice to our democracy, because the
Right.
people who care the most end up caring less, because those issues which are close to them never end up getting the airtime or the attention they deserve. And instead, we're
Yeah.
left with basically soap opera politics,
Yeah.
which, if your politician
I
doesn't get
agree.
the rose, then you don't end up continuing watching anymore. So I think the
I
forum you've
agree with
provided
you.
that allows for honest, brave, frank, open, and I guess friendly
Speaking your,
interrogation of the issues
yeah,
is a
speaking your
really good
mind.
way forward.
Mm.
In
Mm.
terms, and that's why I really like the new media, because it's democratizing the way we get our message out. So
Yeah.
if I could have a final point, it would be the
Yes.
way we the way we talk about politics is a big part of the future, and the way we
Mm.
talk about politics now is not conducive. Being adversarial, being personal, being
Mm.
nasty, being cheeky, being funny, and I've probably done all of the above as well. So I'd be dishonest if I said I didn't play the performer a little bit in some
Yeah.
of my debates. But that's how you get ahead. That's how you play the game.
Mm.
Therefore,
Mm.
we've got to change the game and the rules of the game. And having the
And
rules
I
of the
think,
game being, let's be frank, let's be honest, let's be informative,
mm,
let's bring substance, facts, and
yeah.
insights to our conversations. And
Mm.
let's not make it about personalities. Let's say, look,
Correct.
to the Green Party, I respect what you've said, but I don't agree on this, this, and this, and here's why. And have a
Mm.
dialogue rather than a debate.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
having a conversation rather than a conflict over the issues.
Yes.
And while it might not make great TV, it makes for a much greater democracy. That would be my final message.
Thank you so much for that compliment, Rob. Yeah, my attempt is an intention is, as you rightly said, when you are using words grandfather, I just love it. I am also, as I said at the start, I don't want to use the word politics. And when politics comes, this is where the debate, conflicts, gossips, all sorts comes in. I would rather change the word of politics to social service. Let's call
If I
it
could,
social
if I could be
service.
really cheeky, if I could be really cheeky,
Yeah.
I would even just challenge that because you not wanting to use the word politics isn't because of the word politics, it's because of what's become associated with it. The word
Mm.
politics comes from the word polis, which is Greek for
Oh, yes.
community. And that's exactly
Yeah.
what you're talking about, community. So what we
Mm.
need to do is we need to take back that word politics the same way we need to take back our democracy and our ability to have a
Right.
conversation in it. So
Sure.
let's stop making politics a dirty word because that's what it's become. It's the backstabbing
Mm.
and the nastiness and the personalities. That's what
Yes.
politics
Yes.
has come to represent. Actually,
Mhm.
politics is all about it is social service, it is community, it is future,
Mm.
it is everything that we want to aspire to
Yeah.
within a society. Let's not abandon the word politics. Let's take it back and reclaim its true meaning.
Let's begin the true meaning. Yeah, let's live up to its true meaning. Just like when they say the news was all about real news. So NEWS was north, east, west, south. It's called so, but news from everywhere, and that's where the real news. But people have utilized, they have created news rather than giving the news. They are creating
Yeah,
news, and which is what is not good media. But yeah, no, 100% agree on that. With that note, I think thank you so much, Rob, for
and
this
thank you so much for having
wonderful
me.
conversation that I had with you. And I would love to see more and more conversations. And yes, we will try to change and we will regain the word politics in real sense. And we will also regain the senior words and the words how we utilize for grandfather and grandmother and make this nation more as a, we are an island, we are a small island, but we are a family. The whole nation is a family. And let's put it into that perspective. With that note, once again, thanks very much for your great positive outcomes that you have given me and the visions that you have for different topics. And let's continue these conversations once again. So looking forward to more and more conversations of this, Rob. And I wish you best of luck for your, and we will need more people like you. And just like you were dragged in, I think you should drag more and more people like you who would be making huge difference to this, our economy and our nation. Yes. Yeah. Thanks very much, Rob.
Thank you, my friend.
Yeah. All right. Catch up later. So you can answer that.
So, one positive thing that has happened to me is that even though COVID has made this is the most tough election I've ever been through, it's made me much more resilient and adaptive as a person. It's changed what I thought was possible. I've
Mm-hmm.
grown and developed and extended myself as a person, and it's
Right.
meant I've come across a huge variety of networks that has given me a much more well-rounded um, understanding of the people in my community and in my country. And the second, which is what positive thing do I want to see happening going forward, other than New Zealand first getting over 5% and being back into government on election day, I
Yeah.
would really love to see us um, start to rethink the way we do business, the way we do economy, and the way
Mm-hmm.
we do society in New Zealand, because we've seen other nations find themselves at a fork in the road and they've
Mm-hmm.
gone down a path that has made them very polarized, very divided, um,
Yeah.
and very basically communities torn apart. I don't think we have to go that way in New Zealand.
Yeah.
I think we can find a better consensus, a whole lot more cooperation
Mm-hmm.
by doing things in a special Kiwi way, whether it's democracy, society, media, or business. And by tapping into that unique Kiwi way of doing things, we can forge ahead with a better future and be an example to the world of what a fair
Yeah.
and just society looks like. That's my message.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. Final word, you can just thank NZ World News for the interview.
Of course. Thank you very much, NZ News, the only positive news media station out there and the only news that reports the news.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Rob. Thank you so
Not a
much.
lot.
We will catch up once again. Thank you.